camera will start. There we go. Today we're going to be talking about writing internal and external emotions. The reason this is important is because a lot of times I think that we as writers either do one of two things. We either just tell it like it is and say, they are sad. That's boring. It's good if you're writing like a children's novel or if you're writing a children's book. But if you are writing anything above like uh, 5-year-old reading level, you're gonna want to do it more advanced than that. However, if you are writing it for small children, then great. Excellent. Even then, though, I would say there are certain techniques you can use that we if we wanted to talk about early middle grade writing, I could pull out one, analyze it, and we could do a whole lesson on it. But only if y'all are interested. Most people I find want to do upper middle grade YA or adult. So that being said, we typically either do I am sad or they are sad, or we go the alternate direction and we don't share their feelings at all, and we instead show so much that it is not fully clear. Like telling is good, but not if you get into the purple prose category. Purple prose is when you share so much detail about the environment and the person and everything around them. That's when those jokes come in where it's like I'm on page 2 and they've only finished describing the bushes. Um, that's purple prose. Now, do some people love purple prose? 100%. Some people, that is their thing. But I will say in traditional publishing, purple prose is a big no. If you want to independently publish, then I would say by all means, purple prose it up. Some people love that. But just keep in mind that most traditional publishers, that's a no for them because most readers don't like that. But if you just want to cater specifically to your purple prose audience, go wild. Um, enjoy. Um, next thing I will say is keep in mind what perspective you're doing. Third person omniscient, for example. Third person omniscient is going to have a lot more external showing of emotions than it is internal. Even though third person omniscient can show internal emotions and internal thoughts, you don't want to do too much of that because then it just feels like third person limited with head help. Third person limited being only one person's point of view, but if you're just constantly being like, I'm in their head for 8 pages and now whoop, I'm in someone else's head, that's going to give your character, your reader, whiplash from going from one character's head into the next character. Now, jumping around a little bit is fine with omniscient, just so long as you do it well. What do I mean when I say do it well? Well, too many times saying well. The best way to do omniscient third person is to keep in mind what everyone's thinking and feeling at that moment. Really be in tune with all of your characters simultaneously. If you get too attached to one character, that's when you slip into third person limited accidentally. Um, and even though you can focus primarily on one person with third person omniscient, I would say that it is not encouraged because then it just starts getting confusing as to whether it's limited or omniscient. If you're going to do that sort of thing, I would often say make the setting a character in and of itself, then it makes it feel more omniscient, even if you're doing it only from one person's point of view, because you're doing it technically from also the setting's point of view. If you have kind of a Mother Nature vibe going on there, or some sort of spiritual entities watching them or something. That helps bring back that omniscient feeling if you're not going to have multiple characters all in the same room constantly. Most books can be written in first person, third person limited, or third person omniscient. However, I'm sure you've all run into third person limited switching point of view. It is incredibly popular. It is my favorite way to write. Some people like it, some people don't. Once again, opinions abound when it comes to writing. One thing I will say though, if you're going to do third person limited switching points of view, I would highly recommend that you dive into the secondary, not the first, because it's just Percy Jackson from the first, but the secondary series, Blood of Olympus, that Rick Riordan does, because he does a fantastic job of doing third person limited switching. Even people I know who don't like third person limited switching enjoy his stuff because of the way he does it. And mainly that's because of the fact that he has one thing that all the characters really give good narrative for. There's a reason for their narration. It isn't just, oh, I'm bored, so I'm switching points of view. It's, I'm switching points of view to tell you this specific plot point relevant information. So even if you hate that character, you kind of have to read that point of view, right? and you kind of enjoy reading it anyway because you're learning valuable information even if you don't like the character. Um, and it can help keep them reading if they don't enjoy a specific character. Um, although I will say sometimes you cannot compensate enough. Um, there was one particular book where it was third limited switching that I hated the other character so much that I couldn't get through the book even with the other character. So I will say don't make your character too hateable, but if you do have a couple hateable characters, a good way to get through it is to have third limited switching, so that way you can get through the rough bits and still have enjoyable bits to your story. Now, that being said, let's get back to writing emotions specifically. First, I'm going to talk about first person. Obviously, first person is the easiest way to show external and internal emotions, which is why I'm covering it first, because this is kind of going from easy to medium to hard mode discussion here. So, let's talk about the easiest. And no, does that mean that does that mean that writing from first person point of view is easy, period? No, it just means it's the easiest to convey the emotions to the reader. It is just as difficult as any other writing formula, but it does make those emotions a lot more obvious. For example, my stomach tightened. This is a great way to show external emotion, but also internal emotion, because it's an external manifestation of that internal emotion. Often when you're anxious, you feel like you can't eat, you can't sleep, all those kinds of things because you're just so tight, so stressed. This is a great way to show that through external means, but also belie what's internal. This is incredibly important because if you just basically say, like, they did X, they did Y, they did Z, that gets kind of boring. We don't know how they feel about it, so we have no reason to be attached to them. So, for example, if this character is really, really anxious because they have submitted to some sort of magazine and they're worried that they're not going to get in, then they might, but just saying they submitted to the magazine, they got the letter, they didn't want to open the letter. That's very boring. However, if you say they noticed the email in their inbox and their shoulders tightened and they bit their bottom lip, did they dare open the email? That's far more interesting. That shows a lot more of that internal and external fight within them, which then makes us feel like they're more real. Without emotions, it just feels like a bunch of automatons on a page, which, if you guess, if you're writing about a robot, works. But if you're not writing about a robot, you probably want to instill emotion. And even then, you probably want to instill emotion because then we'll just be like, it's a robot and get bored. That's why oftentimes you'll see in movies and TV shows and books that robots tend to gain emotion because that's what makes us as readers relate to them and want to read more about them. Another great first person example is tactful telling. I couldn't swallow. My throat was so constricted. You're saying her throat is constricted. You're saying she can't swallow, but it implies that she is either stressed or potentially crying because both of those things cause your throat to constrict. Or perhaps she's even being strangled. There's a lot of stuff that isn't being said there that can be given in further context. But at the same time, with that, it is giving us hints at what is happening and what could be going on without just saying she is being strangled to death right now. Like, that makes it so much less interesting. All right, let's move into third person limited, which I would say is of medium hardness when it comes to showing emotions. The reason I say it's of medium hardness is because of the fact that typically this is even harder to slip into telling instead of tactful telling. Tactful telling being where, like I said, you give hints at things, but you don't give us the whole situation. With third person limited, it's hard to not just say they are in the kitchen and she is being murdered right now. And it's like, okay, let's paint the scene instead of just like stabbing the scene onto the paper. You can use a painting knife to very gracefully put the paint on the page, but don't just stab it. Metaphorically, of course. I mean, I guess you can stab a canvas if you want, but that's your choice. So a great example of this is Beatrice tapped her foot and her hand twitched. Now, even though we don't know the situation, we can infer a lot from this, right? We can infer anxiety. We can infer that maybe she's ADHD, maybe she's impatient. There's a lot of emotions that could be going in here. And the more you give the context, the more things unfold. It's kind of like those little pop up books you get as a kid where you open each page and a new thing pops out. If you just tried to open the whole book at once, have you ever done that? And then they all just kind of pop out everywhere. It's a big fat mess. You don't want to just give it to us all at once. Give it to us in pieces and bits and lead us along. This is kind of where people get worried about being like, but did I give enough of my world? Did I give enough of my character? That's something you want to worry about in a second draft. Right now, just focus on trying to paint the scene to your best of your ability. And then later, if someone's like, by the way, we don't know her hair color, you can fix that. That being said, another example is of tactful telling, because I'm trying to do both showing and tactful telling. The words Lucas just uttered made Beatrice's heart fall. This says that her heart is falling. It tells us exactly what she's feeling. However, it is doing so in a very tactful way because it is giving action to those emotions. Instead of just saying the words that Lucas just uttered made Beatrice sad, we're saying heart fall. That makes it so it is more tactful because we're, again, implying the emotion instead of just straight up saying it. You just want to remember with tactful telling, it's all about the implication of the words. You want to use a lot more metaphors, a lot more similes to convey that. Whereas with showing, you're going to use the actions themselves. So if I was to reiterate that sentence with just showing, I would say like, Beatrice pulled her hand away, her jaw dropping slightly. She couldn't believe it. Had he just said that? That makes it a lot more showing because you're showing through actions that her heart is falling in her chest by her reactions. So this is kind of explaining that internal versus external feelings. All right. Now, with third person omniscient, probably one of the hardest ones to do correctly without getting confused for third person limited. Typically, I would say the best way to do that is to show and not tactfully tell, or if you do, very limited tactful telling, because of the fact that showing is going to give us that without getting inside their head. And that's what you want to avoid the most of with third person omniscient, is getting inside their head. The more you're inside their head, the more it feels like third person limited. So again, smidgen of it, treat it like a spice. You want to be like, hey, I'm going to add a little dash of salt. You don't just dump the can. And so, especially with third person omniscient, the more salty your soup is, the more it's going to feel like third person limited. Whereas if you just have a little sprinkle, it'll come off like third person omniscient is supposed to come off. Both sentences that we referenced earlier for third person limited easily could be third person omniscient. The only difference is that you would then want to immediately show Lucas's actions in that scenario. And so as a result, you have equal showing of both people's actions. Treat it more like you're narrating a movie. That's going to be more third person omniscient because you are the third person who knows everything as you're watching it and describing it. That's why third person omniscient typically has its own narrator that has their own personality. That way that narrator can have that outside point of view, and you as a reader also don't get confused about who's talking because the narrator is talking. All right. In that case, you can get a lot more into the narrator's thoughts if you want to. They can just kind of like say it whatever they want. Some of your parents may not want you to watch this, but the first episode, I believe, is clean enough that you guys could theoretically watch. The first season, first episode of Good Omens has a character named Agnes Nutter, and she technically is the narrator of the whole first season. And if you watch that first episode, you can very much feel that third person omniscient vibe because of the fact that she is telling the story through her prophecies. So that is a great example of third person omniscient. Sweet. More people. All right. So, next thing we're going to talk about is thoughts. Specifically getting as internal as possible. Now, as I mentioned before, when it comes to internal dialogue and thoughts, first person, use it in as much abundance as you possibly can. Treat it like your own personal journal, but from that character's point of view. Like, just go nuts. But if you're doing third person limited, you probably want to keep it to more like every once in a while, dabble it throughout the piece. But with third person omniscient, you almost never want to do that unless you absolutely have to. And even then, you can convey it through other means. For example, you could do a letter talking about their internal thoughts instead of actually showing their internal thoughts. There are a lot of ways you can get around that instead of just going straight to the heart of the matter. However, if you are going to do internal thoughts, you want to make sure that you're formatting it right. Internal thoughts should always be in first person present tense. I don't know about you, but unless your character's really weird, they probably talk about themselves in first person present tense in their head. Now, if you want to make them very super weird and have them talk about themselves in third person past tense in their head, I guess they can, but then you're going to want to acknowledge that it's weird because otherwise your reader's going to look at you like, and you got to hang a lantern on it, as Brandon Sanderson likes to say, and make it obvious that that's a problem. Like if you say it in third person past tense, be like, Regina didn't know why she did such a thing, or something like that. Like have it clear that even the character is just kind of like, I don't know why I do that, but I like it, or something like that. So that way the reader's like not like thinking you messed up. They're like, this is intentional. If you're going to intentionally mess up, let the reader know you're intentionally messing it up. But otherwise, you want them to be in first person present tense and you want them to be in italics and no quotation marks. I've seen a lot recently where people are doing quotation marks with italics or just quotation marks. Quotation marks is something that used to be popular amongst books, but it is now no longer considered the acceptable format. Similar to how double spaces after periods used to be the acceptable format, but that's because of the fact that double spaces after every period was necessary to make the sentences not too squished together. Now that we have digital processors, they just put in a function that says make it larger. And so if you do double spaces, that actually looks weird. So it's no longer considered viable. Same thing with thoughts. With thoughts, you always want to put them in italics. That is the new updated version. And again, no quotation marks. Only quotation marks if it is dialogue, please. As far as thoughts go, a lot of good examples can include things like, I'm going to die here. I can feel the breath leaving my lungs. What did I not say to Rebecca? Or different things like that. That makes it so you can show a lot more of their internal thoughts directly. Get at the heart of the matter. Again, third person omniscient makes this difficult, but that's why most people do third person limited or first person. Because third person omniscient, though it is interesting, it is incredibly difficult to pull off. Not impossible, just incredibly difficult. Keeping, as far as things go with internal and external thoughts, the best thing that you can possibly do for internal and external emotions and thoughts is make sure that every paragraph has some sort of emotion in it. Why? Because unless the person is trying to avoid feeling emotions, generally we have an emotion. I'm feeling emotions while standing here. You're feeling emotions while sitting there. She's feeling emotions while sitting there. Like, you're all feeling things while you sit here. You're not just like, I'm sitting here emotionless. And if they are feeling no emotions, acknowledge why they aren't feeling emotions. Are they a robot? Have they gone through something incredibly traumatic and so they haven't fully processed it yet? Are they going through something that hasn't quite processed in their mind yet, so they're like in denial? But even then, that's an emotion. Denial of emotion is still an emotion. It's just an incredibly complex, confusing emotion. Or even if they're trying to ignore a certain scenario, they'll probably try to ignore those emotions by replacing them with alternate emotions. So you may notice that a lot of people who have been through a lot of trauma in their life or struggle to deal with deep emotions might joke more than other people because they cope with trauma through joking. And so they may try to make light of their scenario. So they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I totally like busted my knee the other day, but it's totally fine. It's fine." And it's like it's not fine. And like those are all perfectly acceptable things to do as a person. But it also shows you a lot about the character and what they have been through. Are they the classic masculine man who feels like crying's unacceptable? Or are they a more soft man who was raised by someone who helped them to really get in tune with their emotions and they are okay crying around people? Are they a woman who felt like they had to grow up too fast due to certain scenarios, and so as a result they ask more masculine because they feel they had to take on a much more mature role at a young age? There are all sorts of emotions that you can play with your characters. So don't forget to put those emotions into your manuscript as often as possible, especially from your main character. Other emotions from your side characters, 100%. Don't forget to do that. Otherwise, your side characters will just be cardboard cutouts that your main character's talking to. That could be a very weird story by itself. Anyway, um, it reminds me of the movie I Am Legend. Anyway, where he's talking to all the cutouts in the city. Anyway, point being though, that there's a lot of emotion in reality, and there's a lot of emotion with characters, and that's what helps them feel three-dimensional. So the more that you can show that, the better, especially because you can use it as foreshadowing. For example, going back to our example of someone submitting to a magazine and hoping that they get in and they get published, right? Um, if they are going to ultimately throw that email out because they feel that their parents don't approve of their writing career and therefore they might actually be disappointed in them, then you should foreshadow that. You should say, hey, um, the pit in their stomach just continued to grow as their parents discussed all of the different things with regarding to their future. And then they are like, hey, I've considered writing. They're like, what a great hobby or something like that. I hope this isn't real for any of you. But point being, if this was to be a scenario your character was going through, that pit continuing to grow in their stomach would show as good foreshadowing to us. So when they throw out that email without even bothering to look at it and see if they get published, that then feels more realistic than if they're just like, I don't know, maybe I will, maybe I won't. Throw it in the garbage. It's like, okay, but why? And so showing that emotional foreshadowing can really help to also give us an idea of what this character is like and what motivates their decisions. Because let's be honest here, you'd like to say that your decisions are all motivated by logic. They aren't. Emotion is 90% of how we make our decisions, even though what we'd like to say that we are a very logical society. Just because we have a lot of brain cells to use does not mean we always use brain cells. We often use our hearts, or we use them in tandem together. Um, so it's incredibly important to establish that with your character and establish what they are feeling, because that is ultimately going to affect how the reader interprets their actions. All right, do you have any questions about showing internal or external emotions with your characters? How to do it well, or questions about specific things? I know I didn't cover second person. That's mainly because of the fact that with second person, you don't want to show emotions for the reader because the reader's supposed to be the one deciding. So typically I would say with second person, if you are going to say like your heart beats faster or something like that, make sure it's a scenario in which their heart would beat faster and it's not just an opinion. Um, for example, if you are writing a choose your own story and you're like, their heart beats faster seeing the hot man and they're a gay lesbian woman, they probably wouldn't have their heart beat faster seeing the hot man. So as a result, you don't want to force certain things upon your reader. And if you are going to, you got to make that clear in your blurb and say, hey, this is specifically geared towards straight women, or this is specifically geared towards gay men, or whatever. So that way you are clear on what they're going to be reading, because otherwise they're going to feel like you're forcing these emotions upon them. Instead of being like, hey, what would you do in this scenario? Which is why a lot of second person stories are choose your own stories, because then you have options. That way your reader's not sitting here going like, what? You made me go down the scary alleyway. I don't want to go down the sketchy, scary alleyway. And so having options makes it so it's a lot more realistic feeling for the reader if you're going to do second person. Realized I didn't cover that and wanted to quickly summarize. Because that is probably, I would say, like, Goes from easiest in first person, medium hardness in in third person limited, omniscient being hard, and then second person being like the hardest to convey emotions because technically your reader's the one feeling the emotions. So that one's more like how to lure your reader into feeling things. So, questions? No particular questions? Okay. Just as a reminder, we have another contest coming up. It's going to be the Spring Fantasy Contest. The concept is write a short fantasy story that involves a character coming across a mysterious waterfall. The waterfall can be whatever you want as long as the story is short and fantasy. We did change the word count. Unfortunately, we had so many people entering that had 6,000 words or just under 6,000 words, and we had so many people enter that we cannot do that anymore. It takes too much time. So we have limited it to 3,000 words because we have enough entries that 3,000 we can make work, but 6,000 is just too many. That being said, though, those are not due until the end of April, so you have lots of time to work on that. Technically, I won't be putting out the entry forms, though, until February, but that's mainly just because of the fact that the library wants me to wait a little bit to advertise that, but because you guys are here, I'm going to tell you early. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask. As for YouTube, please comment below if you have any questions or things like that.